Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by co-host Eric Ibarra and also Suan Sonna. How are you?
Doing well, Michael.
Y'all doing good? It is a freezing day over here in Louisiana, as I was saying here backstage. It is one of those rare occasions where it's actually snowing, or was snowing earlier this morning. So it was really nice to wake up and see all the white. But now it's really dirty because, the kids were in the yard and they're trying to build a snowman, but it has, there's dirt and everything that they were getting. So, yeah, it looked nice at first. Now it just looks like a bunch of mess.
Yeah, I know what that's like. Over here in Wisconsin, it's normal.
Yeah, y'all get that all the time. So, yeah, I'm a little envious about that. But at the same time, I don't like having to turn the heaters on and seeing my breath whenever I breathe in here. So.
While you're indoors.
While I'm indoors, right? I'm wearing a jacket. Well, how are you, Suan? It's good to have you.
Hey, Michael, thanks for having me. And Eric, it's good to see you again.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah, it's good to have you. And we're talking about the papacy in Scripture. Tell me a little bit about yourself and, your bio. I understand that you're a philosophy student at, let's see, Kansas State University. You also have a podcast that you're a host of, and it's called Intellectual Conservatism. If anybody wants to check it out, I'll put a link to it in the description. But yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you a cradle Catholic, convert?
Yeah, Michael. So I'm a convert to Catholicism. So it was at last Pentecost I actually officially entered the church, but I actually made the decision to become Catholic during, let's see here, it was the fall semester of my sophomore year at college. So I kind of knew from then on.
In the world would make you want to become Catholic today? What was it? You there? I think you froze up on us. Hello.
Yeah, I think we may have had.
He froze up on us.
Yeah, that's okay. I'll send him a message here real quick.
Yeah, if you can, well, I don't know if you can hear us right now, but if you could exit and come right back, that might help. Sometimes it does it. Just kind of depends on what the issue is.
Yeah, but college is a place where the world of ideas come to play for a lot of people.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of people leave the church when they become college students, but then you have some who, they actually come to the church in those days.
Yeah, when I was in, what's interesting about me is I actually had a roommate who it was one of these anonymous roommate systems where you move in and they don't tell you who your roommate is.
Right.
So here I come, this atheist, and I moved in on a Sunday morning, so of course the roommate wasn't there, but his stuff was there, and he had a bookshelf full of Bible commentaries and creation evolution books.
What was he, Reformed or something? What?
He was a Reformed Baptist.
He was Reformed. Okay, gotcha.
So you could imagine.
Reformed Baptist. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So for about 6 months, we were locking horns till like 2 a.m. Talking.
Was that your first exposure to the Reformed?
That was my first exposure because I had only known Catholicism before that.
Some would say he's not actually Reformed.
Oh yeah, no, I think that now this particular guy now he went to seminary. I think he's got his master's. He may have his doctorate now. Right. Yeah, he would say soteriologically he is more Reformed, but ecclesiologically he is.
At least he recognizes that. At least he'll admit it, because there's some of those Reformed Baptists who will just insist that they're Reformed through and through. But yeah. Anyways.
So I told Suan to just try and log back in, so we'll just wait for him.
Sometimes it helps. I noticed that a lot of the issues I previously had was because I was connected through Wi-Fi, and it's not the best idea whenever you stream. They say just go ahead and hardwire or use an Ethernet cable. And since I've done that, I really haven't had any connectivity issues. So
the hardwire is better, obviously much more reliable.
Right. Right.
I'm actually on a Wi-Fi, which is one of the reasons why I've always had some issues, but thank God it hasn't happened in some time. So
yeah, I mean, it seems to be working pretty well. So
I was
yeah,
on
you.
I was on a recent podcast with Pat Flynn.
Mhm.
So if you guys are listening, I actually did another podcast with Pat Flynn on YouTube, and that was up, and I got a chance to share a little bit about my own testimony from atheism. So
What
if
was the
anybody wants
topic of
to,
the show?
he invited me on to talk about orthodoxy, like many of
Right.
the people who asked me to come on. I don't know why I get asked to talk about that a lot,
Mhm.
and which is funny because um, like when Matt Fradd had asked me to come on his show,
Mhm.
I thought it was going to be more about my testimony, but
Right.
then the title was "Should We Become Eastern Orthodox?"
Right.
um, no, but Pat Flynn was gracious. I mean, he asked me to come on and talk about that, but we just started talking about our testimonies, and
Right.
that's at the very end. He asked me, some questions about the church and the papacy and the Orthodox, but it doesn't really come up as the main. It
Right.
turns out he lives 40 minutes away, so we're actually gonna
Far from
get
you.
together soon.
Yeah, you're in a good area. You're nearby a lot of Catholics, because everyone that I talk to, I always ask them where they're at, and it's always kind of in that Michigan, Wisconsin
Oh
area.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean,
It's the mecca of Catholicism.
you have a lot of old Catholic churches here,
Yeah,
and
a lot of Lutherans too.
yeah, you know what? The Lutherans that are here, they're more traditional kind of. Well, let me
Yeah.
rephrase that. I actually looked up the Lutheran churches closest to my house,
Mhm.
and I went onto the websites, and I immediately saw females dressed up
Oh, okay. Right.
in the
Right.
vestments. um, and they were having a blast with the congregation. So I knew that was modern. But when I drive around, I see a lot of churches. I'm like, oh wow, look at this Catholic church,
Right.
and it turns out to be a
There's a
Lutheran
Lutheran
church.
church. Yeah, some of those are nicer than ours. There was, I think it was in El Dorado, Arkansas. I was driving over there they had a low mass, so I went to visit it. And the Catholic church looked like a Pentecostal. I mean, it just looked, it was clearly Protestant in its design. And the Protestant church there looked like, old school cathedral kind of Catholic architecture. And I'm just thinking, this is so sad when the Protestants have us beat in our church here.
Right. Well, speaking of which, we have we have a change
Yeah,
in our canon.
right,
I think it's only with regard to the Latin Church, but the Eastern churches don't have that. But now we have officially in the print, because it's already been practically there,
right,
female lectors and acolytes.
right.
So, which one of the things that's good about it is that he specified in there that woman cannot be ordained to the ordained priesthood
Mhm.
and into the ordained ministry, which I'm sure caused some upset for a lot of the petitions that go to Rome on this issue. But at
Right.
the same time, we know what's going to happen with this, and that is that a lot of parishes are going to have, like Dr. Peter Kwasniewski said earlier today, a lot of the Karens are going to start pulling for more authority, in
How's that any
more.
different than what we already have? I
Yeah,
don't see it.
it's practically the same
We
thing.
already have that. So
Yeah, it's practically the same thing. I'm just concerned about what kind of vestments are going to go with this, because I know that females are going to want to, especially with the more traditional communities. Um, if I wonder how that's going to work. Um, I mean,
yeah,
it's got to really depend on the pastor who's going to allow it. I'm assuming that they can't just say, "Well, you have to let me, in particular, as a woman, if a woman asks, be a lector." It's got to come under some sort of pastoral permission as well. But
mhm.
I just hesitate to see what's going to happen.
I mean, as far as liturgical garments, how's that any different than what we already have? I remember I brought a family member to mass one time, and yeah, they said, "I didn't know y'all have women priests here."
Oh wow!
And
I've actually
and I
never seen
explained,
that
well,
yet.
we don't have women priests here, but what it is the female altar servers are dressed in regular altar server garb, and so they seemed like priests to this person who didn't know any better. So, they already wear the liturgical vestments of an altar server. So, I mean, I would imagine that's what they're just going to continue to do.
Right. And
Right.
and it's really going to be more of an issue of boldness. Pope
Right.
Francis has made
Right.
this change, and
Right.
they're going to be more bold about it.
Yeah.
But effectively, and I don't see any young girls doing this. I think the kind of females that have been asking for this are the older ones.
Yeah. Well, in 20 years, I don't know if they'll be around. So.
Right.
I don't know how much of a difference this really makes. Good to have you back on, Suan. How are you? Can you hear us well?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect.
Sure can.
Okay, yeah. So the quality might not be as good. So
no,
I think
it sounds good. It's coming through really well. Yeah.
I think the laptop with all my research on it just died, so I'm now using my dad's laptop. So we're gonna see how this goes. But yeah,
coming through well. Audio and video is really clean. So yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, all that's in my head. So yeah.
I was asking you, what in the world in 2021 under the current pontificate would make you decide to become Catholic?
Yeah, so I became Catholic back in 2020. This was during my my fall semester of my sophomore year. Mm-hmm. And basically what happened was, well, when I was in high school, like I always had respect for the Catholic Church, and I was raised to follow Christ, to follow the scriptures. Mm-hmm. And growing up, I had a very good family, and they raised me to love Christ and love truth above all else. So as time passed, I got really interested in kind of conservative thought. So that's why, I'm part of intellectual conservatism. And I wanted to know. So originally I was a liberal democratic socialist. And I thought, like this seems to be the right way. Jesus was this activist figure and so forth. And, that's how I understood Christ. And then as time passed, I started reading like, the natural law thinkers of the Catholic faith, like St. Thomas Aquinas, or even the new natural law thinkers like Robert George. And then I realized that, okay, Catholics are pretty smart. They got some good people on their side. So I thought, okay, let me see if this is true. So then as time passed, it's a long story, but basically, because of my love for Christ and my desire to understand him fully and know him as he is, understand him in his original context, understand what he was like as a Palestinian Jew, understand what his church was like. My heart, my mind, my spirit, everything just got pulled in to wanting to know everything about the Lord that I love. And that's what led me to the Catholic faith. So yeah, like I knew that there were some controversies in Catholicism, and and people have their opinions about Pope Francis, but I was like, but then, at the end of the day, it's really all about Christ, right? And if the Catholic faith is true, then it doesn't matter necessarily like, if the Pope maybe says a thing here and there or does something we don't like. What matters ultimately is Christ going to protect his church? And does he have a church that he built on the earth that we are called to be a part of? And then that's when things really fell into place for me.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on there, because at the end of the day, we may not like some of the things that are going on. We may not like what is taking place today. For example, like we were just talking about, Eric and myself, we were just talking about the reform there to the Code of Canon Law for the Latin Rite when it comes to the minor orders in relation to women. So, I mean, we might not like some of these things, but at the same time, the question boils down to, is this something that was divinely instituted? And if so, we really don't have any option now, do we? So, I mean, that's where, in my opinion, the debate really is. So, I mean, let's dive in and talk about that. When it comes to the papacy and scripture, I mean, you can take it wherever you want it, but one of the things that I was maybe curious if you wanted to comment on is what convinced you scripturally that the papacy is of divine institution?
Yeah, so I'll go through like I'll just present briefly like the arguments that convinced me, right? Mm-hmm. So one is when I started realizing that the vast majority of scholars agree that Peter is the rock in Matthew 16:18. So the vast majority of scholars today, since about the 1980s, have had a consensus that the person of Peter is the rock upon which Christ built his church. The second thing is that I saw the parallel between Matthew 16:19 and Isaiah 22:22 to just be indisputable. The parallel being that Peter is represented in the New Testament as like a prime minister of Christ's kingdom. And then third, I saw that recently there's been a book written by a Lutheran scholar. His name is Roger David Oss. And he wrote a book on John 21:15 and 19. And in that book, he argued essentially that Peter is the successor of Christ. So Peter could be properly called the vicar of Christ in a sense. And, and I can go into all of that. And then the fourth thing is that one of my friends showed me an argument from Luke chapter 12:42 to 48 that basically took the three other arguments and put them together to show that Peter is the supreme steward that Christ was instituting over the church to watch over the apostles and everyone else. And the more I studied like Jewish tradition and read about, rabbinic sources and the legal mindset of the time, I realized that Christ really did institute a magisterium, and that was enough to kind of settle it for me. So I honestly believe from the scripture alone, you can get the following thesis, right? Christ established a successional Petrine ministry that is supreme and infallible. You can get that from scripture. And I was so amazed when I found this, and especially the fact that like 90% of the sources that I use. So, I looked at like over 100 sources, like 100 commentaries, papers, doctoral theses on this matter. And when I looked at it, I just saw that the vast majority of Protestant scholars, even though they were saying, okay, look, I know that this sounds like this supports the papacy, but it doesn't, right? But let's just give the Catholics this point, right? So Peter is the rock. Okay, Peter is the prime minister. Okay, Peter is the successor of Christ. Okay, Peter has the power to bind and loose on his own or whatever. I started realizing that where have I been this entire time? There's been so much happening underneath the surface in the New Testament scholarly community that it's amazing the position that we're in right now.
So I have a couple follow-up questions here. You're appealing to Matthew 16, Peter being the rock, and appealing to Matthew 16 in relation to Isaiah 22. I agree with you as far as making those connections, but why do you think it's the case that some of the fathers didn't necessarily make those connections? For example, we have a few fathers who seem to identify his confession as the rock, and we also have only a handful of fathers that make the connection between Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22, to my knowledge. If it is so clear as the scholarly consensus indicates, as you mentioned, why didn't the fathers see it more clearly? Or am I misunderstanding, misrepresenting the fathers?
No, I don't think so. So, yeah, I mean, the fathers do have a diversity of opinion on Matthew 16, 18, and 19. I think the main point that I would emphasize is that, one is that, of course, like the doctrine of the papacy had to develop, and that as awareness grew of who Christ really was, and as all the theology and just the, because if you think about it, right, like Christ's life was a 3-year ministry that basically, if he's the Messiah, right, he's taking the traditions of Moses, the prophecies about David, and in 3 years, Christ is essentially rebuilding Israel, right? So I think that you could kind of compare it to a tsunami just suddenly hitting, the first century world. And then, of course, as time passes, there's going to be a lot of need to reflect on sources and so on and so forth. But I would say that, the fathers have their reasons, right? But I'm saying today, among scholars, the recognition is there, especially since we can now look at the entire text. We easily have the codex and digital copies to kind of cross-reference and do that sort of thing. And I guess another thing that I would add is, even if the fathers don't pick up on it, Roger David Oss talks about in his book, a lot of the traditions surrounding Peter, especially in John 21, 15 and 19, where Peter would have been understood as the new Joshua and the successor of Christ. Oss makes the point that, like so many people would not pick up on the Judaic background of John 21, 15 and 19 if they did not originally come from that Palestinian Jewish community. So I think there's a lot of things that could be missed in translation. We have access to the codex and digital sources now. We have scholarly hindsight, so to speak. So I guess those would be some of the responses. But I definitely don't think they're devastating. And I think they're also sometimes just sidestepping the issue. And it's fascinating, right? That like, even if the fathers didn't fully recognize it, history kind of developed with Petrine supremacy coming into play. Not immediately, of course, but that's how the history developed anyway. So maybe there's providence there. I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of these scholars and others who are watching might object and say, yeah, okay, sure, Peter's the rock. Yeah, sure, Peter had the authority to bind the loose. All those things that you said. But that is not, that it does not, is not transmitted to successors. I mean, it just stops with Peter. So what is your scriptural proof that this is passed on to someone beyond Peter?
Yeah, so I think there are two arguments that I would give. And so one of them is the following. So the first is that the keys, right, can be transferred to successors. We know, for instance, in the Old Testament, with the keys that Eliakim possessed, his predecessors were Ahishar, I think it's Jotham, Shebna, of course, and there's another figure in there, right? But obviously the power of the keys could be passed to successors. And the other thing is, too, is that if you look at, are you still there?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I can hear you. Are you able to hear and see me?
Yeah, I thought you guys were frozen for a second. Yeah.
No, I'm here.
But, and then secondarily, the power to bind and loose can be passed to successors. So in Matthew 23, 1-3, Christ talks about how you must obey the scribes and the Pharisees because they're seated on the throne of Moses. In the commentary, the Gospel of Matthew, Judaic Traditions, Martha Cohen and Marcia Cohen and Herbert Bass, they make the argument that the throne of Moses is, technically speaking, the symbol of the high court in Israel. That basically the throne of Moses was what the scribes and Pharisees could appeal to say we have the authority to bind and loose. So in effect, then, the Pharisees and the scribes in the first century, and this is the term that they use, they had ex cathedra powers. Because from the throne of Moses, they could make these rulings and bind the conscience of the people, and they could interpret infallibly. So even in Craig S. Keener's 2014 commentary on the New Testament, IBP commentary on the New Testament background or something like that, Keener notes that during the time of Christ, the Jews believed that the Pharisees had the power to enact the rulings of the high court in heaven. So they had this power, and hence that's why Christ says, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So the key point is this. So we see that the apostles are given the power to bind and loose, so is Peter, and we see that this is connected back to the throne of Moses, right? And then most people don't really contest, and I think it's just beyond all reasonable doubt, that Christ is the new Moses. So if anyone's going to establish a new magisterium, a new high court, it's going to be Christ. So the interesting point is that Alfred Edersheim, who's a Jewish convert to Christianity, in his book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, he actually points out that the high court in Israel, they would pass, they would transfer their power to bind and loose through the laying on of hands. And if you recall in the New Testament, this is not only a way to supplement receiving the Holy Spirit, but it's also a way in which someone could become part of the apostolic ministry, right, by the laying on of hands by the elders. And Edersheim notes that in the Jewish legal tradition, in order for someone to legitimately serve as a priest or as a judge, they had to be able to trace their ordination back to Joshua and Moses. So this is where we get the idea of apostolic succession from. It comes straight out of Judaism. So the point I'm making here is that if Christ is correct, well, of course he's correct. If Christ is correct, right, that the throne of Moses is there in Matthew 23, 1-3, the scribes and Pharisees had it in the first century, and let's say Moses was around maybe 1900 years before these events, then the high court of Israel, which is established in Deuteronomy 17 and Exodus 18, that lasted for 1900 years through the succession process. So then in the case of Peter receiving the power to bind and loose, right, then it seems obvious to me that, you know, he would also be able to pass on his power to successors if he willed it. And then there's more that can be said here, but I think I'll stop there and see if that's satisfactory.
Yeah, it's very helpful. I mean, now another question that I have is, when you look there at Matthew 28, 18 through 20, I believe, the Great Commission, It notes the authority that Christ has that he's passing on to the apostles and the disciples. It's to last until the end of the age. So whatever authority he had invested into the apostles, which would include Peter, including any unique prerogatives that he gave to Peter, seems to indicate that that would last until the end of the age, which is well after their death. I mean, we're still in that age, right? So it would seem that it's implicit in that text that whatever authority he invested with the apostles and whatever unique authority he gave to Peter would perpetuate. Would you agree with that argument?
I think so. And, another one of my arguments concerns Luke chapter 12, in which Christ talks about how he's going to set up a supreme steward, basically. And this supreme steward is going to be around until Christ returns. So he says, when the master returns and he finds the supreme steward, right? So he says, the steward who, doesn't live up to the calling that he's given, he's going to be chopped to pieces, right? So he's going to face an extreme penalty. But then the supreme steward who lives up to his calling, right? Or, and so on and so forth. Christ goes through these different kinds of stewards that will be there when he returns. But the point being is that in that particular passage, I think actually the supreme steward is Peter. But, we can get into that, right? But I would agree with you. I mean, even if I'm remembering properly, it's the New Expositor's Commentary on the Gospel of Luke. It does talk about, let's see here, and then other sources do talk about how the apostolic ministry, clearly in the consciousness of Christ, is supposed to continue until he returns. So what all goes into that ministry is going to be the relevant question.
I have one more question. I'm going to pass it on to Eric. So what would you say to those who say, okay, yeah, Peter is given authority there in Matthew 16, but seems that authority is also passed on to the rest of the apostles, hence to their successors, the bishops. And if you would say, well, in Matthew 16, Peter singled out with the keys, he's being given the keys, whereas the keys aren't mentioned in Matthew 18. What would you do with the fact that the Catholic Church elsewhere in various ecumenical councils affirm that the rest of the apostles also share in the keys and the bishops in a sense share in the keys? So what distinguishes Peter from the rest of the apostles and hence the Pope from the College of Bishops scripturally?
Right. So I think it would be two things. So the first is to recognize that if we're going to accept the typological parallel of Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19, then there's certain things that we should recognize then about the keys themselves. So before I go into that, let me just mention that both Craig L. Blomberg in a commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament and in Donald Guthrie's The New Bible Commentary, both of them say that it is almost certain that Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19 are typological parallels. And I just want to emphasize, right, that Craig L. Blomberg, he's a very well-respected Protestant defender of the New Testament. So this is a significant source, right? So they recognize that it's almost certain that the two are parallels with one another. Now, in the Old Testament, the keys are given to obviously the prime minister or the master of the palace, the major domo, whatever you want to call it. And the keys had two functions. So the keys, on one hand, allowed the master of the palace to open up the palace for its official day. So anyone who wanted to come in, an ambassador, a trader, a merchant, whatever, the prime minister would first have to open up the palace to allow them to come in and to control traffic, right? The second thing that the prime minister had power over, or rather what the keys signified, was the prime minister's authority, so his distinct authority. And the reason why is because some translations of Isaiah 22:22 say that the key of the house of David will be placed upon your shoulder. And the reason why it says that is because the keys in the Old Testament were these giant things that the prime minister would have to carry literally on his shoulders in order to open the gate. So Craig Keener talks about this, and various other scholars mention that the keys have this twofold function. So one could make the argument that maybe binding and loosing and open and shutting, or open and closing in Isaiah 22:22 are analogs, right? They're sufficiently similar to maybe be considered interconnected with each other in some way, right? So sure, you could get the keys that way through recognizing that the apostles and the others have the power to open up the kingdom. They have the power to excommunicate, right? Which is what some have considered that power to be, with binding and loosing and open and shutting. But then you still don't, I still think that you still miss the fact, right? That one is that Peter distinctively gets the keys, right? So when he's given the power to bind and loose, he specifically gets the keys. And the keys have a twofold function, one of which perhaps could be shared with the other apostles, but the other of which could remain intact, which is the authority of the prime minister himself, which is only found in that Isaiah 22:22 passage. But the other thing I do want to say is that I'm actually inclined not to say that, I'm inclined to say that Matthew 16:19 and 18:18 are clear enough to where the point being made is that Peter distinctively received the keys, and that anyone who wants to receive the keys has to go through Peter in some way, or has to be in harmony with him. So for instance, in like the power to bind and loose, is sufficient for Matthew 18:18, right? So in Matthew 18:18, where the power to bind and loose is mentioned, you don't need to mention the keys, because the idea of binding and loosing was already well developed in the first century, to the point that if Christ were to give the power to bind and loose to the apostles, then he doesn't have to mention the keys, because it's already understood what that entails. But the keys are really unique and almost seem extraneous or extra, right, so to speak. And it only applies when Peter, so to speak, gets it. Now, then I would also say that you have to place this within the context of, other Petrine primacy arguments, and to just show, yeah, there's something distinct going on with Peter here. Aside from that, I think I could give other arguments, but I'll just stop there and see what your thoughts are.
Is it fair then to say that, yes, all of the apostles receive the keys, but Peter receives them in a unique sense that the others don't, and then number two, that the others receive the keys through Peter? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although, yeah, I mean, so if what you say is true, right, the church has said that the other apostles kind of share in the keys in the sense of, let's say, opening up the kingdom. Typically, most Protestant exegetes who will argue that Peter distinctively received the keys, if they don't want to make the prime minister connection, they'll just make the point that in Acts 15:7, he opens up the church to Gentiles, and in that sense, he received the keys to open up the church. And if that's what you mean by the keys, then yeah, I mean, the other apostles also opened up the church in the Acts 15 council, and I'd also say, yeah, the bishops have the power to excommunicate and so on and so forth. So sure, if that's what you mean by the keys.
There's that general sense in which everybody receives the keys, but a more unique sense in which Peter alone receives them.
Right, yeah.
Because beyond that. Yeah. Excellent. Well, Eric, let me pass it over to you. Sorry to keep the conversation going so long there.
That's okay. Is my audio coming through?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Suan. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, when I was first looking into the papacy myself, as an Anglican, I was more inclined not to take that position. The position that Peter receives the keys in an exclusive way, and then only the bishops of Rome receive the keys after him because they succeed St. Peter. And the reason why I at first anyway that position was suspect to me is because there's just so much evidence in the church fathers, from biblical commentaries on those relevant passages, that signify that bishops and presbyters have the ministry of the keys by virtue of their ordination, and so being ordained to the to holy orders was understood to be a way of communicating the keys, and again they specified the keys because I remember hearing that there's a distinction between the keys and the powers of binding and loosing, and that's so that I personally I've never been able to see that sustained, because it seems to me that the keys are what's doing the action. sort of like when Christ says in the book of Revelation, where he has the key of David, and then locking and unlocking would be the logical activity of that key of the key, and so binding and loosing seem to be something that is inextricably tied to the keys. But I do remember, going through the fathers and recognizing that there is a primacy given to St. Peter that's understood by the fathers. And many of them do point to this issue of him receiving the keys. So there's got to be a way to merge the two things together. There's got to be a way to merge the fact that the keys have a general application, but then have a singular, exclusive significance. And I think what the Catholic Church has done to try and bridge these two things together, that's in the patristic data, and then it would comport with the scriptural data that you presented, is that in order to lawfully use the power that comes through the sacrament of ordination, so in other words, i.e., the power of the keys, in some capacity, right? Because presbyters don't have the power to change canon law, but they have the power to absolve sins. But the power to change canons or the power to change discipline, that's really not in the hands of the presbyters. So there's some capacity where it's the bishop who has the power of the keys. And then there has to be another capacity where this idea of supreme and unchallengeable authority pertaining to the keys would be in the hands of the Pope. And so I think the way the Catholic Church has resolved this is that in the Catechism nowadays it says, that even though all the apostles were given the call to go out and preach the gospel, to administer sacraments, and to govern to govern the faithful, but that jurisdiction is not lawfully possessed or exercised outside of communion with Peter, who's the key holder in this unique sense. So he's entrusted with this, so there's that hierarchical significance to the keys, where it's not just one man always using the keys, and if anybody wants the keys to be used, they have to go to that one man. In this sense, it would be there's a hierarchical significance where the Petrine ministry is sort of like at the top or at the center, and then you've got this reverberation of that significance of the keys in the other under orders of the Pope's office. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense to a great extent. And I mean, so actually, I want to go to now the page that I was talking about in the Alfred Edersheim source. So this is his book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, page 856. So he talks about how, let's see here, the highest tribunal was that of the 71, or the Great Sanhedrin, which met first in one of the tribunal chambers or temple chambers, the so-called Lishkoth Hagazith, or chamber of the hewn stones, and at which time they were we write in the booths of the sons of Annas. The judges of all these courts were equally set apart by ordination, originally that of the laying on of hands. Ordination was conferred by three, of whom at least one must have been himself ordained and able to trace up his ordination through Joshua to Moses. So the point being here is that if one's going to have a valid ministry in the times of Christ and even in the Old Testament, they had to trace their ordination. At least one of the men presiding or ordaining the person in question had to trace their ordination through Joshua into Moses. And the point I'm making is that if Peter, and I haven't made this argument yet, but if Peter can be called the new Joshua and Christ can be called the new Moses, and in that sense, Christ creates a new Sanhedrin, a new high court, a new kind of magisterial Pharisaical body, right? Then it would be the case then that you had better be in harmony with the new Joshua to get to the new Moses, right? The second point I'd make, Eric, is that, yeah, like, I mean, I think it's obvious to me that there's a connection between open and closing in Isaiah 22:22 and binding and loosing in Matthew's gospel. Although the thing is that binding and loosing in the time of Christ, it was, you know, some people have made the analogy that they're quite similar to the keys in the Old Testament, right? And that the Pharisees and the scribes are like lesser kind of prime ministers, so to speak. I mean, I you know, you can make that argument. But I really think that binding and loosing were also their own independent ideas, right? They were mature ideas that Christ could have used easily to express what he wanted to get across in Matthew 18:18, which was church discipline, right? And excommunication and that sort of thing. So I would just want to say that, sure, like binding and loosing, I would say they're similar to the power of opening and closing that's in Isaiah 22:22, but there's still a distinction somewhat to be had, right? And maybe this is not the hill to die on, but that's just a point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, I think you've got some precedent there too. I mean, it can't. I think when I say inextricably tied, I think I meant in that verse, but because we have evidence from like the Qumran community, some of the commentaries and the field manuals of how to conduct themselves in their communities speak about the power to bind and loose, but they talk about it, the power to ban members who have already been initiated, but have not kept the community law. So whether it was due to eating the wrong food or not observing a certain fast, they would get like a 3-month ban, and that was understood to be the elders of the Qumran sect would have the power to bind. And then once the 3 months was up, the elder of the Qumran community would have the power to loose. So and no keys being mentioned, right? So so there's definitely precedent there. The other thing I wanted to say was in my research on the crypts of the Roman catacombs, you probably have read about this in your studies, but there's a fresco in the catacombs of Pope Saint Clement, which has that famous Traditia Legis, which is Moses handing the law, but Peter and then the picture of Peter holding up the law. And so there's definitely that Mosaic to Petrine transition that seems to be signified by the fresco. And obviously the keys, the Traditio Clavis, would come later in later medieval artwork with the handing on of the keys. But have you come across that in your readings at all about that fresco? Because that one always caught my attention when I've read about this.
Yeah, I did actually. So I was happy to hear you mention it. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I really like that signification, because it really does kind of jive with what we hear later in the Fathers, that the chair of Peter in Rome has this this individuating function to be a principle of unity for for all the churches, and that seems to have Mosaic significance.
Yeah, and Eric, if I could also just make the case now for Peter being the new Joshua.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot of this comes from Roger David Oss's book. It's a long title, but the title is Simon Peter's Denial and Jesus' Commissioning Him as His Successor in John 21:15 and 19. So this was written in, I believe, 2013, and this is a Lutheran Protestant scholar who is making this argument that Peter received the throne of Moses. So here's how the argument runs, right? So the first part of the argument is just saying, okay, we recognize that Christ is the new Moses, in part because Jewish messianic prophecy held that just as it was with the first Redeemer, Moses, so it shall be with the last, the Messiah or Christ. So it's obvious then that Christ is the new Moses. So then, the connection then has to be, how do we get to the new Joshua? So there are 3 things to note. So the first is that in Josephus's writings, it's in the Antiquities, I think, book 6, Josephus mentions that Joshua is the disciple of Moses. So he uses a particular Greek word to designate that that Joshua is the disciple of Moses. Likewise, in the New Testament, the disciples are described with the same noun, the same Greek noun. So then it's fair to say that, okay, Joshua was a disciple. We can say that Peter was a disciple. That's a very loose connection, but hey, it's good enough, right? To start off with. The second thing is that the context of John's gospel heavily draws upon throughout the death of Moses. So there's a midrash entitled the Peteret Moshe, which describes the death of Moses. In John 19:27, when Christ hands his mother over, Christ hands his mother over to the apostle John. Likewise, in the Peteret Moshe, before Moses died, he handed his mother onto Joshua. So there's that connection there in the text. Let's see here. Moses describes how, or actually Christ talks about how Peter is going to be like girdled or veiled, or his hands will be stretched out right before he dies. Likewise, Moses in Jewish tradition, before he's dying, he's full of kind of sadness and fear because, who's going to take care of Israel now? And he's described as actually being girdled and veiled, right? And taken to a place where he doesn't want to be taken. And then even when Christ talks about your hands are going to be outstretched, right? When he talks to Peter, right? This is a reference to crucifixion. Aaron in the Old Testament dies with his hands outstretched. And then Moses pleads to die like Aaron. So he pleads to God to die like Aaron. And then we know that Christ as the new Moses, and if we make this argument that Peter's the new Joshua, right? Peter, according to church tradition, longed also to die in the same way as the new Moses, right? By crucifixion. So there's a theme going on here that is surrounding the Judaic traditions concerning the death of Moses, and they reach their climax in this John 21:15-19 passage. Now, the key giveaway that Peter is being presented as the new Joshua is that when Moses hands over the flock of Israel to Joshua, he mentions three kinds of sheep. He mentions the sheep who are young, the sheep who are elderly, right, or older, and then he mentions the sheep who are like young, more mature, right? So there's these three kind of sheep. And then in the same passage in which we deal with John 21:15-19, Christ mentions the same three kind of sheep, except he organizes it in terms of a progression of age. At least that's what Roger David Oss notes, and I think even Ambrose in his commentary on this particular passage noted the same. So the point then is that Peter is clearly being presented here as the new Joshua, and that even Oss goes so as far to say that the Hellenistic and Palestinian Jews who were aware of this gospel, who were followers of Christ, it's very possible that they would have recognized that Peter was seated on the throne of Moses, because during the time of Christ, like pre-70 CE, the belief was that, at least in the Midrashes, right, that Jewish tradition held Joshua exclusively received the throne of Moses, and such that anyone who wanted legitimacy in their ministry after Moses had to go through Joshua. So if that's the case, and Peter is the new Joshua, then if we can use these same Judaic sources that inform John 20:15-19 to also now understand the role of Peter in the early church, then Peter would have the throne of the new Moses in himself. And there's actually a particular passage that shows that Peter has the throne of Moses in himself. I don't know. Do you want me to get into that, Eric?
Sure.
Okay, sure. So, the high court is established in in Deuteronomy 17, and it's around verse 11, right? So I think it's like 8 to 14, but it's chapter 17, verses like 8 to 14. And, Baster and Cohen and other scholars note that this is when the high court is instituted. And there's the point where it says in that particular passage in Deuteronomy, when the priest or judge gives his ruling, listen to everything that he tells you, do everything that he tells you to do. In Matthew 23:1-3, what does Christ say to the people after he mentions that they have the throne of Moses, the scribes and Pharisees? Listen and do everything that they do. So clearly Christ is mentioning that Deuteronomy passage when he's mentioning the high court in the New Testament and the throne of Moses, right? So that connection's being made. Now, the next part of the passage talks about in Deuteronomy how whoever dishonors the presiding judge or a priest, whoever dishonors him, he must be eliminated. That means put to death. And that, once this person is eliminated, all of Israel will be filled with fear and will not do that action again. In Acts chapter 5, Peter rebukes Ananias and Sapphira. God strikes them down both times. And then both times in Acts, it says, and the entire church was filled with fear. And the entire church was filled with fear, and nobody ever dared to do their act again, right? So clearly, Peter is presented here as being able to bind and loose on his own. So if binding and loosing includes the legislative function of interpreting scripture and the judicial function of disciplining believers, and Peter uses the power to bind and loose to discipline Ananias and Sapphira, right? And he can have the high court in himself, then he can bind and loose by himself with the high court in his person, right? And there's more that I wanted to say there, but I think that gets the point across, right? That Peter is able to exercise the throne of Moses, the high court, by himself. And he's the only one that gets to do it with immediate divine endorsement.
Right. There's no mediation, right?
Right. Yeah.
He was given the right.
And I just wanted to mention that. So this argument that I made just now, if you look at Hard Sayings of the Bible by Walter Kaiser and F. Bruce, they actually note that Peter can bind and loose by himself. So.
Yeah. Have you read G.K. Beale and Don? I mean, this is a little bit dated, but there was a book written it was edited rather by G.K. Beale and D.A. Carson. The New Testament use of the Old Testament.
Yeah, that was the source that I cited with Craig L. Blomberg.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, that.
No, you're good.
I remember them saying that there was Isaianic significance to Matthew 16 as well. So, anyway, Michael, I don't have any other question. If you want to proceed from here on what you glean from what Swan's saying.
Well, I mean, I'm curious if you have any other scriptural arguments for those who still might remain skeptical. Are there any others that you would call to your defense that would perhaps show that the Pope is, Peter perhaps is distinct from the other apostles insofar as the authority that's given to him, and that it perpetuates to the successors, the bishops. So, of course, the Pope in relation to the College of Bishops.
Yeah, I mean, so let's see. So far that I've talked about Peter being the rock. So I'm hoping that nobody really has objection to that, right? So the person of Peter is the rock. Second, Peter's the prime minister of Christ's messianic kingdom. So I just want to emphasize, right, that the Messiah, when he comes, he's expected to bring a kingdom. He's expected to rebuild and restore the nation of Israel. And the Protestant scholar F. David Farnell in his essay titled the Kingdom of God in the New Testament, right? The Master's Seminary Journal. He discusses how, it's expected that Christ is going to bring a kingdom, and the New Testament actually alludes that the church is the new Israel. The church is the restoration of Israel, right? Because it's expanding the ministry of Israel beyond just the Jews, and it's including the entire world. The Messiah is going to rule over the entire world, so his kingdom has to expand over the entire world, right? So the point is that Matthew 16:19 and the whole idea of Peter being a Davidic prime minister, that's part of the Davidic narrative, part of the messianic narrative of Judaism, right? So that has to be included within the story. And then when it comes to, John 21:15-19, remember Peter being the vicar of Christ, the successor of Christ, being able to exercise the throne of Moses in himself, by himself, right? That's incredibly significant. But so all these arguments then build up to, I think, another argument, which I mentioned, which was in Luke chapter 12, verse 42-48. Christ is talking about stewardship, and the apostle Peter, he asks him, Christ, is this for us or is this for everybody? And then Christ talks about, so you want to know who the supreme steward is, right? The steward whom the master will give all of his servants and possessions to, right? And then Christ lists 4 criterion for who the supreme steward is going to be. So he mentions on one hand, so it's various scholars have noticed that, like for instance, I think Darrell Bach in his commentary on Luke notes that like the apostles are the ones who are mainly being directed in this context as the stewards taking care of the church, right? So the supreme steward, singular, is going to be an apostle. he's going to be described as a steward, or in the Greek, an oikonomos. Various other New Testament commentaries note that the office of the prime minister that is given to Peter in the New Testament can also be called like a supreme steward, an oikonomos, right? So Peter seems to meet that criterion. And then it says, and Christ says, this servant will feed the other servants at their appointed time. Who's told to feed the sheep of Christ? Peter in John 21:15-19, right? And then finally, Christ knows that this servant is going to be a servant among the others, but he's going to have this special position where all the other servants and all the other master's possessions are going to be in his hand, right? So the point I'd make here is that, okay, if you accept the other arguments, then they all climax here, I think, in this Luke 12:42-48 passage, where we seem to get an apostle, a steward who feeds the other servants and is a servant himself, but the main servant, right? And that seems to get us to a kind of Petrine supremacy argument here. And, some people might say, well, look, it mentions other kind of stewards, and Christ kind of speaks in hypotheticals, right? So the servant who is not ready when the master returns, he's going to be chopped up to pieces, right? I mean, what if that's an allusion to successors of the supreme steward's office, such that some of them can fail really bad and some of them can actually succeed and do well? So I'm just going to say there that I think that someone is more than justified in saying, I think the supreme steward is Peter in this context.
Now, there's a good question here. It was similar to the one I was going to ask, but not 100% identical, but I'll go ahead and ask it. Best response to Eastern Orthodox who say papal primacy isn't present in the canons of the first 7 ecumenical councils. Any thoughts on that in particular?
Right. So, Eric Ibarra is like the expert, and I think you too, Michael, on like all the canons and so forth. So for me as a Protestant, right, like I wanted to just start with the scriptures, then I was like, okay, who cares what a canon or council says, right? So I started from the scriptures, but I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, in the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, Philip the Roman legate, he speaks up during the council. I don't think this is a canon, but I mean, he mentions the fact that it has been known, no one can be in doubt that Peter received the keys to the kingdom and that he is the foundation of the Catholic Church, and that his successors up to this moment preside and judge through him. So, I mean, there's that recognition there. But I mean, specific canons, I'm not an expert in that area. I need to study that.
Well, Eric, do you think it's curious maybe that the Pope didn't confirm some of these canons that might cast doubt on the papal claims?
Which canons? You mean canons that were not in existence?
I'm thinking of 381. Sure seems that Rome didn't even receive the canons there. Definitely back them up. I'm also thinking of Chalcedon and Leo's contempt for Canon 28. Although not necessarily because they're a threat to papal supremacy. I understand there were some other reasons, but since people often like to use those to try to question papal primacy, do you think it's curious that maybe some of these weren't ratified? And then the canons that eventually were ratified, it was much later on. There was controversy surrounding them. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, well, it kind of there's a lot of this stuff is shrouded in obscurity. So, for example, the First Council of Nicaea, we don't have the acts for it, but we do know that after the name Osius of Cordoba, who was the Western bishop, who was the president of that council, you have the names of the papal legates from Rome, and so. Which is curious. It really is, because Constantine is really focused on Eastern affairs, and the city of Rome, the city church of Rome, didn't have a lot of engagement with the Egyptian problem with Arius. So it does make somebody wonder why the papal legates would be that their names would be above the Bishop of Alexandria and the Bishop of Antioch, and then the other bishops following after that. So you do see that there's a leadership role that in the councils that Rome has. And the Council of Sardica is really where Western canon law finds its, some sort of a legislation for what papal authority looks like. And that was called by the emperors too, both Eastern and Western. And it was practically received by East and West. It isn't counted as ecumenical, which is very puzzling because it certainly could pass test for being that. But the some of the Easterners that were scheduled to show up didn't show up, but there still was Eastern representation there. Athanasius, for one, that was the second see of Christendom. And then you had vast other bishops from Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine, and other places too. But there they set up a legislative model, which is basically an appellate structure, where the issues have to be resolved in the smallest unit of space. So if you have a problem between you and your friend, you need to resolve it between you and your friend. But if you can't resolve it between you two, then you could bring it to two or three others. And then if you can't resolve it with that, then you bring it to, some leader in your college or society. Same thing with marriage. If you have a husband and wife have a problem with each other, they try to resolve it themselves. If not, they can consult counselors, And then in the church, if you have problems, you bring it to your pastors, right? But if the pastor of a local church can't resolve something, then you can bring it to a regional synod. But what you don't do is, if you have a problem with your friend, go to the highest authority in the world. You don't do that. In fact, that kind of contradicts basic social philosophy. And so the bishops knew this way back in the 2nd century already. We already see that there's laws that were prohibiting bishops from crossing their boundaries and going to another bishop's territory. So certainly the Bishop of Rome is, they're not going to set up a legal system where now, everyone has this instant communication with Rome. But what they do say is, if you've exhausted the measures in a local region of your jurisprudence, you've heard the case, there's been a decision reached, you can lodge an appeal through your synod to Rome, and then Rome is actually vested with the authority to either to confirm the decision or to loosen the decision and have it reheard. And then they appealed to the fact that Rome was the chair of St. Peter.
But then there's those who would say a general council could be appealed to after Rome. How do you respond to that? Is it effectively there's a distinction between appealing to the Pope and then appealing to an ecumenical council over that appeal, and then papal ratification of an ecumenical council? That there's a difference between papal ratification of ecumenical council, which is way up here, the ecumenical council, and then an appeal to Rome. Is that how you would distinguish it, or am I off base there?
Yeah, Michael, really quick too. Like, Michael, after Eric masterfully answers this question, I'd like to also respond to some of the things that I saw in the live chat, if you don't mind. Right? Yeah,
we got some more that we're gonna jump.
All right, cool. Yeah.
Here in just a second.
I'll be quick. So interestingly enough, the Council of Sardica understood that was also with regard to ecumenical councils. So you could actually have an ecumenical council appeal to the Pope. And we see that happening. So like, for example, at the Council of Ephesus 431, when that was finished, it actually didn't get finished very well. The Emperor Theodosius II had to get involved because there was a schism between two synods, the one led by John of Antioch and another one led by Cyril. And they came to an agreement in 433, 2 years after the council. And even then, you have appeals being sent back to Rome because they wanted the Pope to re-examine the decisions at Ephesus and the agreement at 433. So you already have evidence there, but also if you recall, Michael, the Council of Ephesus 449, when that council was pretty large, and you had agreement, you had a lot of signatures being put down, but then the Bishop of Constantinople, Flavian, ended up, and he said it out loud at the final session. He says, "I want to appeal to Rome." So the only way that could make sense for the Bishop of Constantinople, which is the imperial city right at the time, the only way that could make sense is if he thought that it would have gravity there. And certainly the leader of the council, who was Dioscorus, he was not happy about that. But with the events that followed the council, Theodosius's letters from Pulcheria in the west, and then you've got Galla Placidia writing to Pulcheria. You see even the powers that be recognize that, well, Flavian did lodge an appeal, and we have to recognize that. Mm-hmm. And so Marcion ended up picking up the obligation, and that's when he called the Council of Chalcedon. So really, the Sardican canons were really active right there in the midst of an ecumenical council.
This one is from Kale. Why was James the leader of the early church, and how was Paul able to rebuke Peter?
Yeah, so one thing to notice is that, so J.N.D. Kelly, in his Dictionary of the Popes, he actually discusses how we see in Acts chapter 1, Peter immediately begins to speak and talk about who the successor of Judas is going to be, right? Who's going to fill his position. So J.N.D. Kelly actually notes that in the beginning of the church, Peter appears to be the undisputed leader. And then after time, it appears as if James becomes the head of the Jerusalem church. We know that Peter was an evangelist, that he traveled around. So it's going to be hard to actually say, like, if he's going to, settle down and locate in one place. So the fact that James actually, becomes the monoepiscopate of Jerusalem, that's totally fine. The second thing to note is that when it comes to Paul rebuking Peter, some people have actually made the argument that, so Paul in Galatians, I believe, chapter 1, he talks about how he didn't receive his gospel from any humanly source. And then he, continues to hype up his reputation. And then finally, when he gets to Peter, he says, "And I even rebuked Peter to his face." Some people have noted it's almost as if Paul is saying, "I'll even go to Peter," right? And so it's an implicit recognition of his primacy. Now, I don't think that, so Eusebius in his ecclesial history, he talks about how Peter was actually quite hesitant to talk about the fact that he received the keys of the kingdom. Because if he mentions the fact that he received the keys of the kingdom, then he's also going to have to talk about how Christ called him Satan right afterwards for missing out some points on him being the Messiah and having to be crucified. So I think that it's possible, right, that that the reason why Peter was able to be approached was because, he wasn't, if you read other commentaries, such as, for instance, Andreas Korsgaard's on the Gospel of, I believe it's on the Gospel, he discusses that Christ clearly wanted the leaders of the church to be humble in their positions of authority, unlike the Pharisees, right? So, for instance, the Pharisees wanted to be called fathers, even though they technically didn't deserve that title, right? Because they didn't treat the children of Israel well. So Christ wants his apostles to rule or lead the church in such a way that they would be humble. So I think that the reason why Paul can rebuke Peter is because Peter wasn't the type of man to brag about his authority, even if he did have the authority. And then I would just mention all the other biblical arguments that were already given in the typologies. But Michael, can I add something real quick just to respond to some things I saw in the chat? So one is that someone wanted to get the citation on the Midrash. So this is on page 214 of Roger David Oss's book, and he's citing Eisenstein's Ozar Midrashim 2.380. So I'm learning actually how to cite rabbinic sources and study them, but he does locate this in the Peteret Moshe. And so that's Petirat, and then Moshe is Mosheh. So if anyone has questions about that, then, there's the source right there. So some people talked about the typologies, right? And they said these typologies are like me looking up at the clouds and trying to fit things together. it's almost as if they completely miss the point about all the scholars who are making these connections and recognizing that typology formed the New Testament to such a large extent. The typologies between David and Christ, the typologies between Moses and Christ. Notice that the New Testament never explicitly calls Christ the new Moses, but everywhere you can find, especially in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John, there is this connection between Christ and Moses that is indelibly there because the Messiah was prophesied to be the second Moses. So, if you want to collapse typology in one place, then I don't know where you stop it, right? So the arguments that I gave here were from the scholarly community showing that they are making these connections and these aren't arbitrary. So for instance, Patrick Gray, in his Rutledge Guidebook to the New Testament, published in 2017, he also notes that many scholars are now picking up on the connection between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19, and even Craig L. Blomberg and the New Bible Commentary, and as Eric mentioned, the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. People are recognizing that the connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16 is almost certain, and that this is something that many scholars are picking up on. So I think the fact that this person doesn't think that the typology is crazy or whatever, you're kind of missing how the New Testament was written, and what the scholars are now recognizing about the composition of the text and the parallels that are there. So, I mean, some people will say too, what are Suan's credentials? I think I saw that in the comment section. My credentials, I'm a philosophy student at Kansas State. I wanted to explore the issue. I spent hundreds of dollars and hours studying the commentaries and the sources. So if you want to make an appeal to authority or, come for my credentials, then, let's go to the sources. Let's not make it personal.
There's another one here from Ryan. Can we hear Suan's thoughts on the Cephas-Caiaphas parallel and its implications? Peter as the new high priest and the New Testament church as the new Sanhedrin.
Yeah, so I recently did an episode on my channel, Intellectual Conservatism, with Daniel Vecchio, who's another philosopher, and he's a professor. And Vecchio has been collecting multiple sources from, I believe, back to the 1800s in New Testament commentaries to the present moment, in which he's noted that the word in Aramaic for Caiaphas, right, with an Aramaic dialect, it would sound like Cephas. It would sound basically exactly like the name that Christ had given to Peter. And the point is that if Peter is understood to be kind of like a new rabbi or a new high priest, so to speak, or a new head rabbi, then you could make the argument that when Christ changes Simon's name to Cephas, he's also going for Caiaphas's position. So it's a twofold attack, right? Because on one hand, when I talked about how people believe that the Jewish high court could bind or could enact the decisions of heaven, Christ is very deliberately then saying, when he gives the power to bind and loose to the apostles, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. He's directly saying, no, the Pharisees that are in power now, those aren't the real Pharisees anymore. The new Pharisees are my rabbis, my apostles. And then and the point is that Christ is one-upping that perhaps by saying then that, no, and my Cephas, he's the real Caiaphas, right? And what's interesting is that, the Sanhedrin, it had to have I think it was 70 or 72 members present, right, to be the court itself. Christ also appoints 70 or 72 members of his 70 disciples in his, you can call it a Sanhedrin if you want to. So the point being is that Christ clearly understood himself as establishing a new kind of Pharisee, a new kind of rabbi, continuing the old, but with the new now in the Israel that the Messiah was supposed to bring. So that's the argument there. There's a lot of interesting connections between the name of Caiaphas and Cephas, and this connection has been noted faintly throughout history. Some scholars will motion here and there. What if, the reason not only that, Peter is called Cephas, right, is because he's the rock, and the rock is what grounded the Jewish temple, and there was a rock of pagan worship in Caesarea Philippi. But what if it's also because Christ is trying to say that, no, my Cephas is the real Caiaphas? So that's an interesting connection to make, and that's on my channel as well.
I see some more questions in the chat, but they're not specifically about our topic today. So unless I missed something, Y'all let me know. Did I miss anything there in the chat? Was there anything else you wanted to grab from there?
Let me see if there's anything. Eric, do you see anything?
No, I just want to say you have a good point there with typology. You know, typology comes across as dubious almost to everyone. I think that sometimes at first glance, you know, it goes back to the Antiochian reaction to Alexandrian school. Sometimes you look at the typology that the apostles did, like in the beginning of the book of Hebrews or something like that. It's like, wow, the apostles were way off, but really they were reading scripture in a certain narratives and a meta narrative, and that meta narrative was taught to them by Jesus. So it can come off really dubious. We admit that, and just forbear with the process, and you'll see that there is merit to it.
Yeah, that's why I automatically dismiss anybody who is a Christian but writes off typology. I have to immediately dismiss them. Yeah. You cannot be a Christian and dispute the authenticity of typology. All you can do is just say that, well, yes, we affirm typology, but how do
we affirm the types that we like.
How do we know which type is orthodox and which isn't? I mean, that's about all you could do, right? I mean, how do you know when you have gone too far with your typology? Those are the kinds of questions that I take that seriously. Yeah. I understand where somebody's coming from. Because,
Michael, if this is, if people have to go so far as to just totally reject typology or say that it's like looking at like the clouds in the sky or whatever, and the fact that the scholarly community just unanimously stands against that position and recognizes that the New Testament is just filled and composed with typology, then I think we're in pretty good hands, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I want to see a Christian say that they reject typology in front of a Jew. I really want to see how well that goes down when they have to point out to you that Matthew and many others engaged in typology. And they would claim the New Testament authors ripped those Old Testament scriptures out of their context to prove that Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah.
I'd just like to see their reaction to that. Anyways, well, I don't see any others that are about today's topic specifically, so we'll go ahead and end it there. But I'll give you, just a moment here for some concluding thoughts, if you had any.
Yeah. So I mean, I hope that I didn't come off a little too irritated. Right. It's just that sometimes the live stream can get a little crazy. But the point being, right, is that, tonight I presented 4 biblical arguments for the papacy. Right. And I noted that each of these are based on, arguments that scholars widely recognize and accept. So this is not, Roman Catholic exegesis in some crazy corner. Right. This is something that scholars like Craig L. Blomberg, Patrick Gray, Dale Allison, and others will recognize. Right. So I've mentioned that Peter's the rock. We didn't really discuss much of the arguments there, but I'll just say that, the scholars in the community are convinced. There are plenty of good reasons why, and this has been the consensus since about 1985. And the citation for that is the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1985. I looked at that source, and it noted that that was the consensus of scholars from that point. And then Charles L. Talbert, in his 2013 commentary on Matthew's Gospel, notes that, yes, the vast majority of scholars are now on the consensus that that's a valid connection there. When it comes to Peter being the prime minister, I mentioned Patrick Gray, let's see here, Craig S. Keener, and Craig O. Blomberg, and the New Bible Commentary, right? So 4 sources right there that all recognize that there's a connection. I think R.T. France, you can add him to the list, Alan C. Meyer, and others there. So there's plenty of people who recognize that Christ as the Messianic King, as the new David, which is part of the Messianic deposit of Judaism, right, is expected to bring a kingdom on the earth. And he's expected to reach out this kingdom because of Isaiah, I believe, 11, with the shoot of Jesse, that this kingdom will spread throughout the entire world. So the fact that this kingdom, right, is being established in Matthew 16:19 totally fits the Messianic narrative, totally fits how Christ understood himself. And the typology there is already known in the scholarly community to be a valid one. And I actually have 6 reasons why we can know that this typology is valid. I'm trying to actually get this published in some journals, so I'll maybe save those for later. But yeah, so the next thing about Peter being the vicar, the successor of Christ, bearing the throne of the new Moses and being the new Joshua, This was made by a Lutheran scholar in 2013, studying the Jewish sources on the matter. And then, you know, of course, I want people to check the sources and see that what I'm saying is correct. But basically, Peter and Joshua are both called disciples of their Moses. The context around the death of Moses clearly appears in the background of John 21:15 and 19. And then Christ and Moses and Christ both hand the same three kinds of sheep to their Joshuas, for Christ being Peter, for Moses being Joshua. So it's indisputable, right, that there's a connection between the Palestinian Jewish traditions concerning the death of Moses and what ends up appearing in the New Testament. And then I mentioned the argument that Peter is the supreme steward in Luke 12:42-48. I mentioned the fact that binding and loosing did confer infallibility upon the person who bound and loosed. So this can be connected back to the High Court in Jerusalem, the Jewish traditions of the time. When you invoke heaven, you're essentially invoking God in the Jewish tradition. So sometimes the Jews, they would say heaven stands behind my decision, but they're really saying that God stands behind their decision, but they're avoiding invoking the divine name out of piety, right? But the point being is that infallibility is implied here. Christ notes that you're supposed to obey the Pharisees and everything that they teach you because they're seated on the throne of Moses. The throne of Moses would allow the Pharisees to bind and loose ex cathedra from the throne of Moses. That's the term that Bassler and Cohen use in their book, The Gospel of Matthew and Judaic Traditions. And then finally, Peter can bind and loose by himself. He exercises the throne of the new Moses on his own. And if he's the prime minister, then whoever professes Christ to be their Messiah, which means the anointed one or their king, right? Then if they say that Christ is their Messiah, is their king, then wherever that king is, you know, his reign is there too, and so is his prime minister. So if you say that Christ is your Messiah, then you have to also acknowledge that he has a prime minister, and that prime minister is Peter, right? And his successors, as we argue, as we see the keys being transferable, the binding and loosing being able to be transferred for 1900 years through the ordination process of the laying on of hands, clearly practiced in the New Testament. So I'm just going to say then that if the main objection is that these typologies seem crazy, then welcome to the New Testament, you know, and welcome to New Testament scholarship. The arguments that I've given today are the product of hundreds of hours and dollars and time contributed to studying these sources as well as I could. And let me tell you, I started off as a Protestant. I did not want this to be true. Well, here I am. So thank you, Michael, and thank you, Eric.
Thank you for coming on. And I put a link for intellectual conservatism in the description here for the show. But go ahead and put in a plug for anything else that you wanted to, put out there.
Yeah, I think that's about it. Right now, I'm working on some articles defending the papacy and getting them published in academic journals. So that's what I'm working on right now. So just pray that all goes well. And I'm excited.
Yeah, let us know how that goes. I'd like to read those. And of course, if there's another topic on the papacy or really anything else that you want to do, just let us know. We'll have you back on again. We enjoyed it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Eric.
Oh, thank you.
Everybody, thank you for watching. We appreciate your participation there in the chat. Always fun. Don't forget to check us out at reasonandtheology.com. Also, patreon.com/reasonandtheology if you would like to support us. Until next time, God bless.